and to members of the public who are able to watch the process of this meeting. If I could ask Mr. Hanton from Democratic Services to deal with items 1 through to 3 on the agenda and to deal with the housekeeping notes as well. Mr. Hanton.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. May I just start off with apologies. I've received apologies from Councillor Trent, but no other apologies. And item 2, Councillor Cox is substituting tonight for Councillor Trent. And then I could go on to the housekeeping notes, Chairman. Can I just ask everyone to please note that due to technical issues relating to the overrun of a previous meeting, we are unable to live stream the meeting tonight. But nevertheless, an audio and visual recording is being made in exactly the same way as usual and will be available as soon as possible tomorrow through the normal channels. And Chairman, that a notice has been placed on the website to explain this to the public. Chairman, so to ensure that the meeting is managed effectively, please could everyone present follow the normal ground rules for speaking. Only speak when invited to by the Chairman. Always turn on your video function when invited to speak, and please state your name before you speak, so unless you have been introduced by name. Could members please mute your microphone when you're not talking, and if you'd like to speak on an item, please utilise the raise your hand feature. The message bar should not be used unless you are raising a point of order or providing the wording of a motion. If at any point you would like to speak again, please use the raise your hand version once more. If there is a recommendation move that requires a formal vote, this will be undertaken by the Democratic Services Officer, myself, carrying out a roll call of members present and asking for a response of for, against or abstain. And finally, Chairman, please could members ensure that background noise is kept to a minimum and that mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hanton. Item 3 on our agenda is declarations of interest. Do members make? Nobody has indicated, so I will take that there are none. Item 4 is confirmation of the minutes of our last meeting, which was held on the 11th of March 2021. Are members content that those are an accurate record of that meeting and that I can therefore sign them? Anybody dissenting from that, please indicate. Nobody has indicated. In that case, members, I will take it that those minutes are confirmed and I shall sign them in due course. Item 5 is public issues. Mr. Hanton.
Chairman, there are no public issues tonight.
Thank you very much. That takes us on to the first substantive item on the agenda, which is item 6, which is a report of the Constitution Review Working Group and changes to the Constitution, and most particularly issues for the Licensing Committee. And I welcome Councillor Jude Butt, who is chair of the Licensing Committee, to our meeting this evening. Could I ask Councillor Lawrence Williams, Vice Chairman, who is also Chairman of the Constitution Review Working Group, to introduce this item. Vice Chairman.
Thank you. Yes, this is, let me just pull my papers up. Yes, this report summarises the issues considered by the Constitutional Review, a series of recommendations arising from our meetings for consideration by this committee. Any recommendations arriving from the committee shall be referred to full council for adoption. The recommendation from the last meeting, is that the revised arrangements for licensing within Part 3, Rule 3 of the Constitution, as set out in Appendix 1 to this report, be approved. and I think I look to Susan Zeiss to talk this through.
I can do, Chairman, through you.
Thank you.
So Part 3, Section 3.2D of the BCP Constitution does provide that the Licensing Committee can delegate portions of its functions under certain categories to subcommittees. And the Constitution Working Group worked through whether or not this would be something that was available for a change in the Constitution, and agreed that it would be a good idea to continue. There has been mention made of the fact that the clarity around how, if and when Licensing Committee might want to retain certain matters to itself in circumstances where possibly timescales would be prejudiced if they went to a subcommittee, isn't entirely clear in the Constitution. So I have discussed this with the chairman of the Constitution Review Working Group, Councillor Lawrence Williams, and we've agreed that we will put that element of the advice into the normal review of the Constitution as a whole, because we're sure that with doing a little more work, members will agree that we can provide a bit more clarity in that respect. But there's no legal reason why what is being proposed can't be included as a delegation and the creation of subcommittees. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Zeiss. Before I go to members of the committee, I'd very much like to hear from the chair of the Licensing Committee, because I know that this piece of work was essentially instigated at her request in the first place, and I understand some of the practical issues and limitations that it's placed on licensing as a result. And so I think members of the committee would benefit from hearing from Councillor Butt in order that we understand more fully what lies behind this. Councillor Jude Butt.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Vice Chairman, for allowing me to attend today, and very grateful to hear from Ms. Zeiss that there is capacity for this to go ahead. I've written a short scree because there is some information in here which I feel I want to share with the full committee. The Constitution Working Party very happily listened, and I'm pleased that we have a unanimous agreement coming back to your good self, Mr. Chairman. So I will begin. Section 6 of the Licensing Act 2003 requires each licensing authority to establish a licensing committee of between 10 and 15 members to discharge all of its functions under the Licensing Act 2003, and BCP have a committee of 15 members. Section 9 then provides that the Licensing Committee may establish, as we've heard from Ms. Zeiss, subcommittees consisting of 3 such members. Section 10 states that any functions of the Licensing Committee under the 2003 Act may be determined by subcommittee. I'd like you please to refer to your Appendix 1 and E to M. All of these are functions of the Licensing Committee, and under Section 10 they all have capacity to be heard by a subcommittee. A subcommittee of 3 in point mirrors the originating responsible authority magistrates bench of 3 for all hearings, E to M. Appendix 1, as before you, are all hearing application situations. I won't read through them, as the committee will already have read them and noted the appendix information. The Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1982, as amended, provides the power regarding the licensing of sex establishments to the local authority, in that the Licensing Committee can again delegate to a subcommittee. I thought that part was important to raise. It is therefore established that the Licensing Committee can deal with all these hearing applications via a subcommittee, re E to M. However, re little I and J, approving the level of fees charged by the Council and making decisions on the tariffs charged to the public carriage trade, it is wholly appropriate that the full Licensing Committee consider these, as they have a very generic, broad-based approach across all licensable activities. In addition, there are a few other points for consideration, and this, Mr. Chairman, is, I think, what you would like me to touch on with regard to the practicalities. Previously, Poor Council lawfully delegated all hearings regarding any application to a subcommittee, including E to H and K to M, regardless as to who was making the application, thus exercising their function as a licensing authority under the appropriate statutes. The Constitution as it stands, regrettably, perhaps is inferring by its inconsistency in not including E to H and K to M, that a subcommittee cannot be impartial regarding these specific application areas, which is not consistent with the Licensing Act, as Section 10 clearly states that any functions of the Licensing Committee under the 2003 Act may be determined by a subcommittee. Why is it thought necessary, I think we should ask ourselves, to weight certain areas for consideration by the full Licensing Committee when each and every application must be considered purely on its merits? Regrettably, the present constitution implies perhaps that some areas are deemed to have higher significance when under statute this is not provided for. This seems inequitable in its application. However, that said, in 2019, when the constitution was formulated by the BCP Shadow Council, the ratio increase in applications and amalgamating 3 separate authorities into one was clearly not realised. The full Licensing Committee has absolute jurisdiction regarding the setting of policy for many areas of licensable activity, but it's too cumbersome and somewhat intimidating and rather daunting for any hearing applicants to have to appear before 15 elected members and many officers. It impacts seriously on officer time and costs, as a hearing of 15 members will by default take far longer than that of a subcommittee of 3. We had 2 hearings this week and they were lengthy and cumbersome and quite difficult. A fit for purpose 2 weekly subcommittee meeting rota has been in train since April 2019, so that all required hearings can be dealt with efficiently and within required time periods. I did seek legal advice from BCP Senior Licensing Solicitor to confirm that the full council can review and amend the constitution, so functions currently delegated to Licensing Committee can be discharged by a subcommittee. I would ask, Mr. Chairman, having listened to what I have to say, that the committee please give due consideration to my submission, and that the recommendation as put before you today, namely the revised arrangements for the Licensing Committee within Part 3, Rule 3 of the Constitution, as set out in Appendix 1 to this report, be approved. I am most grateful for your time, Mr. Chairman, and for your understanding in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Butt, and as ever, you've got a real grip on the detail of what the proposal is, for which I'm sure members of the committee are extremely grateful. And indeed, you helped us through the previous process of the working group in similar fashion. So thank you for doing that and coming to speak to us this evening. So members, are there any comments, any questions? Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can hear me. I've sat on Licensing Committee in Poole for 12 years, and then I'm now on the BCP Council Licensing Committees, and sat with Councillor Butt on many subcommittees. And I think this is sensible. You know, it's just a practical way of going about things, of having subcommittees to hear the majority of matters, because partly, as Councillor Butt says, you know, it would be too intimidating to have so many councillors facing sort of applicants and objectors, and actually, I think 3 is adequate to properly consider. In my experience, all the subcommittees I've sat on to properly consider all the matters before them. I did have one question. I must confess, I've not sort of previously looked through the constitution details of what's delegated to Licensing Committee, and it talks obviously about a lot of the acts there, about premises licenses, club premises certificates, sexual entertainment venues, etc., etc. One area which it didn't reference, and just wanted to check where it's covered, is around film classifications. Previously in Poole, I spent many years sitting on film classification subcommittees to decide on films that are being shown at the Lighthouse or Bournemouth University and other places, whether they should be a UPG 12, 15, 18, or whatever, because they hadn't previously been classified by the British Board of Film Classification, and we were trained by BBFC to do that. And I just wanted to check where that sits. Is that wholly delegated to officers to do now? I know previously in Poole it was eventually partly delegated to officers. It was only in certain circumstances where a subcommittee would sit to consider it, where it maybe had sort of religious connotations. There have been some quite serious controversies over different films over the years, particularly in the religious arena. I think it's still, is it in Truro, you're still not allowed to show The Life of Brian or something like that, for various reasons. So yeah, it's just really where film classification sits within the delegations.
Thank you very much. Well, Councillor Butt has raised her hand. I assume it's to answer the question.
It was to answer the question, but if Ms Zeiss would like to beat me to the fence, yes, David, Councillor Brown, you're quite right. In Poole, we did delegate to officers, and this is delegation under officers, with a view that if there is something which needs further consideration by the Licensing Committee, there's capacity there. But that again was practicalities, because David, you'll remember the days of us sitting through 6, 7 or 8 student films, and we never got home. They were all very amusing, but it was something that was just so time consuming and so unnecessary. So that was delegated to officers, and this is the case here. Hope that helps.
Yeah, that helps. I mean, it was better when officers used to bring popcorn in for us for these long subcommittees. We actually did that. It actually worked very well. But okay, so that's, I'm happy to know it's sort of delegated to officers, but I guess it would be raised if there, because from time to have been some quite sort of serious controversies about particular films which haven't been classified and wanted to be shown as part of film festivals and that sort of thing. I think it's still important that we retain some oversight of that.
Nobody else has indicated that they wish to speak, so I'll take us to the recommendation, which is that the revised arrangements for the Licensing Committee within Part 3, Rule 3 of the Constitution as set out in Appendix 1 to this report be approved. Are there any members of the committee who dissent from that recommendation, please? No, there are none. So that recommendation is approved, and I hope, Councillor Butt, you find that will provide a far more efficient way of administering your business in licensing. And thank you again so much for coming this evening.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'm extremely grateful to your good self and your Vice Chairman and the full committee, and Ms Zeiss for her advice. Thank you so much. Good evening.
Thank you. Takes us on to item 7 on the agenda, which is risk management and the corporate risk register update. And I'll ask Fiona Manton if she could introduce the report, please. Ms Manton.
Thank you. This is the quarterly update to the Committee of the Council's Corporate Risk Register. Members will be aware that to reflect the continuing impact of the pandemic has on the activities of the Council, a full and comprehensive review took place in October last year to consider the current corporate risks, the pandemic risks, and combine these into one single register. This recognises the ongoing position and the need for all risks to be considered in both their usual context and any additional and continuing impacts of the pandemic. The report this quarter outlines the changes in risk during the quarter, with the detail being provided in Appendix 1, with a summary of changes in paragraphs 8 to 11 of the report. As part of the continuing development of risk management, for this quarter, we've included additional information to the risk summary. What we've done here for this quarter is we've included a target risk score for most of the risks. This is the reconsideration of the net risk score, taking into account any proposed strategies and actions identified to further manage the risk. This supports the risk decision-making process and provides a measurable position in terms of the risk being managed to the target score. In terms of risk updates, the matters I would like to draw to your attention are particularly the addition of corporate risk 8, which relates to the inability to run an election or referendum. This risk is escalated from service level when any elections are taking place, hence the inclusion during this quarter. We've had a change of title to risk 14, the continuity of public health arrangements and evolution of outbreak management plan. This change of the risk title is just to refine and better describe the risk. We've added a further risk at corporate risk 17. This is a new risk which is entitled Risk to the Reputation of Place and the Council if some arrangements are not managed. More detail on all of these risks are provided in Appendix 1. I'd like to say if a detailed risk review has not been possible in advance of the preparation of a report, this should not give members cause for concern. Routinely, the risk manager meets with the Chief Executive every 6 weeks to consider all of the risks and prepare interim updates for consideration as part of the quarterly review process. Whilst risk detail might not be available or provided on a small number of risks, there is an assurance that the level of risk has not changed during the period. And the next interim review is scheduled for early May. Finally, I'd like to draw members' attention to paragraph 16 of the report. The risk team is continuously horizon scanning to identify issues that may give rise to risks and that the council may face. We look to support managers in highlighting information to give them early sighting of such issues and to help them in informing and providing risk challenges to support the inclusion in either corporate or service level risk registers. This point is not covered in my report, but I wanted to raise with members that we would mention that we had a very helpful workshop in April 2020 where members assisted in the identification of additional corporate risks directly relating to COVID-19. I'd like to mention that it's proposed at item 14 in the forward plan, which is later on the agenda for tonight's meeting, that the concept of a further workshop with a proposal to hold this in June with members of this committee will be introduced, which would provide a very good opportunity to revisit risk issues in light of the information now available 1 year on in terms of both corporate risks and those risks we identified particular to COVID-19. So I thought it would be helpful if I mentioned that at this point, although obviously it will be covered more widely in item 14. Thank you for the opportunity to present my report, and I'm happy to assist with any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Manton. That's very helpful. I'm afraid I didn't introduce you properly. You are, for the record, the council's risk and insurance manager, and it's a very wide remit and one which we regularly interface with you on, as you've referred to the additional register that we compiled back in April last year relative to COVID before we integrated the two into the corporate risk register.
Thank you.
Chairman, you've muted yourself.
I have indeed. Thank you very much, Vice Chairman. Are there any questions for Ms. Manton? Well, if there are no questions, could I just take?
Can I just point out, Councillor Cox has his hand raised.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I've missed you, Councillor Cox. You haven't come up on the right-hand side of my screen, but thank you, Vice Chairman. Councillor Cox.
No problem. Don't worry. I have a question, and I suppose it's more to do with the risk owner in terms of the adult social care. I was very interested in this one particularly, but I have to say, point 3 on the further actions, I just don't understand what what was being said there. If you'll excuse the expression, it did come across as verbal diarrhea, and didn't really mean very much. May mean something to somebody, but didn't mean anything to me. And I just wondered if he could elucidate on that particular point. So that was the main point. And in terms of further down the further actions, it does actually talk about as there is no intrinsic risk, there is no target risk date. Well, there is a risk. You have got a target risk date. I think you've got a date to achieve the target score there of March 2024. So I just wondered what that meant.
Ms. Manton, would you like to take those two issues up, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. If I can deal with the second one first, just to explain, risk 1 is split into 2 segments, if you like. The first segment being adult social care, and we have a summary in there in relation to
children's services.
the risk. And then the second part is children's services, where that particular comment is more relevant in terms of there is an intrinsic risk that will remain. But obviously what we are working to do is to have a target score that relates to where we hope the risk will be following the actions we complete. So whilst we accept that the risk may always have a residual level and we will always be taking actions, we will be applying target scores on each aspect of the risk. In relation to your first point, could I just clarify, you're talking about the adult social care element of that list one?
That's right. You know, when it further actions, it says work with local government association to understand and analyse BCP Council's initial use of resources profile for adult social care in order to support further development of the medium-term financial plan for adult social care. I'm not quite sure what further action that actually. I don't understand how that will help anything. But go on. Interested.
Certainly, if it would be no objection, I'd like to take that away, perhaps, and speak to the executive director of adult social care. Although I see the chief exec may be able to assist with this one.
Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, just the piece of work that we're doing with the local government to challenge, effectively, it's an external challenge of our provision of services and use of the budget. So we will get from that some outcomes in terms of trying to help us to plan for the long-term future in terms of our revenue budget on adult social care, which is something in the order of £100 million a year net. So it's a big budget. So we're bringing in the local government association to do that challenge for us. But I think that work is actually taking place at the moment. From my understanding.
So can I therefore confirm you're talking about the funding of adult social care?
Yes.
It doesn't actually say funding.
No, I think you're right. The language isn't as clear as it might have been. So we'll take that on board and look at it. I was also looking at the third bullet point on the left-hand side, which I thought you were referring to, and felt that could be slightly more clearly worded as well. So we'll look at that for next time.
Thank you very much, Chief Executive. Mr. Stannard, you are wanting to comment on this as Head of Audit and Management Assurance, presumably.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just to add to what Chief Exec said there, I wonder if it will assist Councillor Cock to just put some plain language onto what the initial use of resources profile is. That is essentially a benchmarking tool which benchmarks both inputs, money, the number of children and adults looked after, and applies rankings and comparisons to other comparative authorities. So, I hope that's a bit of added information useful to Councillor Cox. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Stannard. I think it isn't just about plain English, it's about useful information. And your suggestions, I think, provide that and give much greater interest and focus for us in trying to discharge our responsibilities. So they're good suggestions, which I hope we can take forward. Are you satisfied with that, Councillor Cox?
Yeah, I just feel as though those things need to be in that risk register so we can all understand them. At the moment, I didn't understand them. So
no, thank you for bringing that forward. I think we've probably got a very positive outcome as a result. So thank you for that. Could I raise one issue which perhaps is probably better directed towards the Chief Executive than Ms. Manton, and it comes back to the workshop that we have got planned, which we'll deal with at the end of this agenda, and around the corporate risk register. And we all recall what we did back in April last year about the COVID risk register, and then we've since brought those together. And I just wondered whether, Chief Executive, you wanted to say anything about how that process might evolve into our meeting on the 10th of June and what added value we can get out of it in terms of the further risks that will no doubt be established and be concerning us as we come out of COVID and beyond.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, the issue for me, I think, the challenge is going to be that we're not going to know enough about what the future of COVID is going to be and how that's going to play out. But we will have some information by then that the NHS will be giving us in terms of likely future trends. So I think at that stage we will want to challenge: do we have the right risks in place? What I hope that the Audit Committee is seeing, this is my intention, is a bit more refinement in terms of the use of those three risk matrices in this presentation. And one of the challenges that I've given us is, if we have a gross risk score of X, in the case of the very first one, it's 16, we do some actions, some mitigations, we get it down to what we think is a 12, in this case of CR1. We're setting a target of 8, because it's moving down another one. Are we showing enough movement for the investment in the mitigations? And I've picked this up partly through a non-exec role I do and partly within the council, but sometimes people have a tendency to put in a risk score, carry out a whole load of mitigations, and then have the risk score exactly the same as it was in the first place. And then my challenge is, well, why are you doing any of that then? Stop doing it, because it's not making any difference. So what I'm hoping that we'll get from the Audit Committee and participate in that workshop is a bit more challenge along those lines of, are we actually making a genuine difference to our risk? And are we genuinely seeing that our risk is being improved? Or do we have an appetite to keep the risk higher and therefore not do some of those mitigations? So I'm hoping that we'll have more of that sort of developed conversation. I have to say, I thought the workshop last year was very encouraging because we saw a very mature approach to risk evaluation by the members of the Audit Committee. I'm hoping that we'll see the next iteration of that and the next development, so that we see a sort of an even more mature approach to risk management. To be frank, I'm very pleased with the work that Fiona's doing. I think she's doing a great job because she's challenging members of the Corporate Management Board and feeding those inputs in, challenging me on a regular basis about the input that we bring to Audit Committee. I'm hoping that gives you a bit more information and ammunition, if you like, to challenge the organisation as a whole. So I think we're moving on to the next stage of our journey of improving risk management, and I'm hoping that the workshop will take us through that a bit more, if that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Chief Executive. I hope that we can try and concentrate at the workshop part of that meeting on exactly those issues. Time will be restricted, but that shouldn't mean that we don't get good value out of the discussion. And I think the way the agenda looks like it might be shaping up, we'll probably have 3/4 of an hour, including Q&A, which should be sufficient, provided we've got the really useful information coming through to us in the form of the workshop itself. So that's to be welcomed, and I hope we can all then go out of that feeling that we've taken the next major step along that road that's going to add value to our work, and of course to mitigation of risk in the longer term. And your point is really well made about the matrix scores and whether they stay the same or whether they're reduced. And that's something which I think historically has often been lost on members and officers as being the crucial way of measuring the effectiveness of the work that's being taken forward. So thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Cox, your hand is up. Is it a legacy hand or is it?
Sorry, legacy hand. Beg your pardon.
Thank you very much indeed. Nobody else has indicated that they wish to speak, so could I take us to the recommendation, please, which is that members of the Audit and Governance Committee note the update provided in this report relating to the corporate risks. So it's a report for noting rather than any specific action, but I'm sure that the input that members will have on the 10th of June will be invaluable in taking that forward. So members, that takes us on to the next item, which is item 8, the information governance update. And this is a regular report to Audit and Governance. And we have with us this evening Viv Bateman, who's the Head of Information Governance, who's going to present. Ms. Bateman.
Good evening, Councillor Beasley. Good evening, everybody. Yep, this is an update report for information governance. I haven't actually done one for a little while. You'll see the last one was in 2019. It is a report just for noting. key things perhaps to take account of are the first part of the report, which indicates that as BCP, we do now have a coherent single framework for our information governance accountability. We have the policies for BCP, those are all in place now, and they have been updated obviously to reflect the legislation as it came along in 2018-19. We have dealt with the issue of the training. I don't think I mentioned that there actually. Those key parts at the beginning, and we have we have a single point of entry into the organisation, which clearly was important when we amalgamated into a single authority, was useful. We needed to make sure that procedurally we had a single point of entry for all of our requests for information. That's working. And we have established the Information Governance Board, which you have the terms of reference there for Appendix A and the membership. And our first meeting was actually held later on the 27th of February 2020. So our actual framework is in place for BCP. We've been working on promoting that, clearly not now through face-to-face training since March this last year. I'm losing track of the years, but that's accepted and understood. Performance management information, if I can just move on to that, key things really on that to note are slightly less requests than I anticipated over the last year and 3 quarters, but I think that is very much the result of COVID. And we are starting to see an increase again now, but I did anticipate against other benchmarked authorities, we'd be getting about 1,600 requests a year. We are slightly lower than that at the moment, with an anticipated still lower figure for the end of this year in, well, it's ended, but obviously we don't have a Q4, unfortunately, to show you at this point in time. Normal spread really of requests coming in from the public and the media and then commercial. The public is slightly misleading. Some of those may also be media. We don't know. It's not something we can ever tell. The other one to draw your attention to in terms of the performance management information is the response rate. No surprise to see that our response rate has reduced. And that's partly as a result, and I think it's fairly self-explanatory, the result of restructuring and COVID, which has had a fairly significant impact on us, but we are beginning to creep back up again to where we need to be, which is around 90%. Important to note that the Information Commissioner's Office has taken a very pragmatic and reasonable approach during these very difficult and exceptional times for local authorities. So they are largely not being enforcing in the way that they perhaps would have done under normal circumstances. So to date, even though we've delayed in some of our responses, there's been no enforcement action, and I wouldn't anticipate that there will be any. We do answer, it's just that we have been delayed in some of that. The restructuring obviously also led to some movement of our information asset advisor network, and in some areas that still needs to come up to a slightly stronger, more robust framework than we have at the moment. But we will be getting there. Smarter structures will impact on that as well as we go through the transformation programme. But and the other thing perhaps is to note our complaints and reviews. Again, slightly higher in some cases than we would have anticipated, but nothing that has caused us any enforcement action. Similarly, with any of our information security breaches, we've managed those. They've been dealt with appropriately within the authority, and where we've reported to the ICO, they've been satisfied with the action that we've taken and haven't required us to take any further action. I'll carry on. There may be some questions on performance management. The team is obviously a small team, and it has been impacted again by the transformation programme, Smarter Structures. So you will see from the current full-time equivalent. We lost the principal IG officer post last March. That's remained vacant, and we haven't appointed to it. And we were impacted by some long-term sickness and maternity absences for a fairly long period of time, but overall the team has continued to deliver key IG services under sort of those rather, again, exceptional circumstances with COVID, resourcing and restructuring. We have been working on issues that we were picked up through the annual government statement report and an internal audit report of July 2020. We are moving forward with the majority of those, and actually most of those are pretty well there. The compliance self-assessment checklist, which is for all service units to use, will be going out very shortly for a trial with the information asset advisors. They're going to form part of an online dashboard, which will include all the performance management information. And the only thing we're waiting for there is some IT input, because we need some updates to our web-based request for information tracker. Once that happens, we should be able to put all the stats up on a more regular basis, which information asset advisors and service directors will be able to just see on the dashboard, which we hope will be useful to them. We think that's going to be complete by about June this year. We're developing a attention and schedule guide for the council, which is based on existing guides, very good ones that they have in other authorities, which will help service units to develop their information assets registers. They have got those, but they need to be refined and improved upon. But we have got them, so we're meeting the requirements of the legislation, but they need to be better than they are at the moment. And clearly, as a result of smarter structures, we may need to review our terms of reference and the composition of the Information Governance Board as we go along. We have managed to, we are actually developing also personal information sharing agreement register, which is something that we should have. IT have been very useful to us in that, and they are again helping us to develop something that will be able to be a web-based system that people can actually contribute to as those information sharing agreements are signed up to. Dorset Information Governance Group died, but has been reconvened very recently, and we've updated and reviewed all our guidance. If anyone has any questions, that's the key things that I need to draw to your attention. Anyone has any questions, be happy to take them.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Bateman. Councillor Brooke.
Fine. Thank you, Chairman. Yes, looking at the freedom of information and the environmental responses rates, yes, it's pleasing to see that there is an overall improvement from one year to the next. But actually, if we focus on that, we're missing the detail. And looking at the detail for individual service units over that time, there are a number of points I think that need to be pulled out, one of which is tremendous inconsistency, not only within an individual service unit from one quarter to another, but also between service units. Now, there may be reasons for that, and it would be interesting to know what those are. But secondly, while some service units do show an improvement trend across the time periods given, there are others which actually, with little or no change in the number of requests, show a deterioration in their response rate performance. And that to me is worrying. So is it possible to have any answers or suggestions relating to my concerns there?
I think, hello, Councillor Brooke. Yes, very, very sensible questions. I think our key problem in some areas is where we still need to address the issue of a slightly stronger information asset advisor group or resource. And this has been drawn to the attention of our service directors, but clearly we've been under such difficult circumstances, both with LGR and followed by COVID. And it has meant that there has been some disruption to those very key people that we have throughout the service units, which is our information asset advisor network. And they are the responsible officers within the service units for making sure that requests for information are responded to. They go out to the officers who have that information, they collate the information, and they deal with the responses. Where there is a high rate of responses, which can vary from month to month and period to period, where they have certainly been impacted by COVID, we have found that they have had some difficulty in keeping up with those requests, and that's what's pulled that response rate down, and it can be very inconsistent. We clearly, as a small team, we do what we can to help, but our role is largely advisory for those requests that are specific to service units. So, but it is something that has been discussed. It is discussed at Information Governance Board, and service directors have been trying to address that issue to make sure that they have sufficient resources to be able to manage FOI requests in the way that we would like to see them managed. And I think that's probably the at the moment. Does that help at all to answer your question?
Yep. Yes, if I may, Chair. Yes, that's fine. And I note within your responses you're raising issues relating to pressure on resources, and I appreciate COVID does have an impact on the situation, and working from home as well potentially makes it more difficult. But looking ahead, with the transformation programme supposedly coming into effect and kicking in, to what extent are you likely to see a reduction in resource pressure or a further increase in resource pressure? Because one way or another, there is going to be a significant impact, hopefully for the better, but it does seem to me that potentially it could make the situation worse.
I would be, and I hope you don't mind me answering in this way, obviously that isn't something that I can anticipate, but clearly I think all service directors are aware that they need to meet the requirements, the compliance requirements of the legislation. Most of our information asset advisors are usually within the business support areas of service directors, service of the actual service units. So they are individuals at the moment who have other tasks associated, and this is one of the other things that they do, which is the information governance side. I can't obviously anticipate in terms of that, of how the business support functionality within the authority is going to be dealt with, but it is something certainly that executive directors are aware of and IGB are aware of. Whether that will then develop into a slightly different approach to dealing with the requests isn't something I can answer at the moment, but I would certainly hope that whatever we do get to will still meet the requirements of the legislation and indeed improve on where we are at the moment.
Chairman, I wonder if I could possibly assist a little here. Sorry to interrupt. Beg your pardon, through you, Chairman. Yes, our Smarter Structures programme is going to have an entirely new look at all of the way in which these things are supported, and we would hope that bringing some of our business support people together will provide for more resilience in some areas, and we're hoping that that will allow, together with hopefully an easing of the pressures from COVID, to us getting back up to our targets.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and actually maybe the way forward in other areas of the council as well, I suspect. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There was two things I wanted to just raise. One is kind of related to what Councillor Buck was talking about. and mine is the other side, because you've talked about the performance, and presumably you've concentrated on performance being the response rate. And I'm just wondering, what do you do to ensure that the people who have requested the information are happy with what they've got? Because it's all very well responding to them, but if we're not responding to them very well, or the people are not very happy, do we measure that at all? And that was one question.
Okay.
Let's do one at a time.
I'll take one at a time if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Good evening, Councillor Cox. I think the indicators for that, clearly from our point of view and within the procedural aspects of legislation, is internal reviews and complaints. So we know when we haven't responded appropriately to something, or certainly an applicant who's received a response is not satisfied, it will come back through the appropriate system as an internal review. And at that point, it is my team that picks that up, because it has to be impartial. So we then pick up and review the way in which a response has been dealt with. There is a table indicating internal reviews and complaints, which overall don't represent a very high percentage of what we deal with. But that's the way the system is managed. Within the law, anyone who makes an application under the Freedom of Information Act or the Environmental Information Regulations, their first port of call has to be back to us requesting an internal review. And I think you can see from the stats that we sometimes hold the position and say, no, we did that correctly. We sometimes release additional information if we find that's the right thing to do. So normally we will resolve most things at internal review stage, but some of those, if they can't be resolved, will go to the Information Commissioner's Officer, and they then come to us in the form of complaints. We haven't had a decision notice against us from the Information Commissioner during the period that I actually held this post, with the exception of one occasion. So I think from that we can assume that largely we do respond to people appropriately, and they do get what they are entitled to have by law.
Yeah, I think it was just, as I'm sure we're all familiar with, asking for information from banks, etc. And we all get back, are you happy with this? And I have to say, I feel a bit of a hypocrite here, because I never respond to these things. And I just wondered if it was part of our procedures, we may be able to have an idea earlier on as to whether people are happy with it. That's all.
I think that's a very useful suggestion. It isn't something that we have done more recently. We originally started to do it. What we actually found was largely people then just, it could often be interesting. People would then actually divert into lots of other things, but they weren't really focused on the request. So we either didn't get responses, or we got ones that weren't really responses in regard to the requests that they'd submitted to us. But I think for future reference, it is something that we can reinstate at some point as automatic feedback, which we would need, I think, now to do online to make it a very easy process for the public, so that they could simply come back to us and say, yes, I was satisfied or not satisfied. But we don't have that system running at the moment. But it's a helpful suggestion. I'm sure one that we could do at some point in the future.
Ms. Sice, I think you wanted to make a comment.
Yes, Councillor Cox, I just wanted to add to what Viv has said, that I think as we're running in a statutory framework, we probably wouldn't want to offer more than what is required of us, because in some circumstances, the obligation to provide information goes only so far and no further. And there is a process for them to request a review, for requesters to request a review, and then their ultimate recourse is to the Information Commissioner. So that's something we could consider, but we might not want to invite too much additional correspondence on these matters, because they are already very time consuming, and we do comply with what's required of us under the law.
Can I just deal with the other point?
Yes, certainly, Councillor Cox.
Thank you. It's to do with the membership of the board, or the governance board. I noticed on there that I can't find it now, but no, it's gone. So I'm going in the wrong direction. That the substitute or the deputy for Adam Richings is Nigel Stannard, which I was quite surprised about on the basis that they're in two separate departments, and that there seemed to be a representative from internal audit. And I would have thought they should not be, one should not be the deputy for the other.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. That's a very good question. Nigel, are you there?
Mr. Stannard, would you like to help us?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, Simon Milne is there as an internal audit representative to the board, as a technical advisor to the board. I'm there, if I am ever there, which, by the way, I've never gone because Adam has always attended. I'm there as a deputy for Adam if he was ill or couldn't attend, as a representative of finance. And just to reassure Councillor Cox, I am in the same unit as Adam. We're both in finance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I thought you were.
Thank you very much.
Bewildered myself there.
It's the point both in finance, but you are supposed to be you're supposed to have, I don't know, a Chinese wall, I would have thought, between the two of you. I know you work together, and it's important that you work together, but to have, on the basis that you are checking largely what he's doing, I would have thought you acting as his deputy, albeit on information, doesn't look good. And that Adam's got lots of very, very capable assistants, and maybe there should be somebody else within his team that should be the deputy. That's all.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Ms. Seiss. Would you like to make any comment on that?
Chairman, I think both of the officers we are referring to have their own statutory responsibilities and obligations to uphold, so I feel quite satisfied that they would be able to, because the Section 151 officer has a certain set of rules and regulations around the way he must behave in all circumstances within his role, as does the head of audit. So I feel quite comfortable that both of the two gentlemen concerned in their positions would be able to maintain that distance and professional objectivity.
Thank you very much, Ms. Seiss. I think Councillor Cox, I mean, if you want to take this up outside the meeting, that's fine. And if you're in correspondence with Ms. Seiss about that, that's probably the most appropriate person. And by all means, copy me and the Vice Chairman into any correspondence so that we can keep a watching brief on it as well. But thank you for raising the issue. Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, my question's not on the sort of the freedom of information side of things, on the other side of information governance, around sort of information security and ICO complaints and that side of things, and also noting the online information governance courses that have been completed and the changes there. Just over the last year, obviously, it notes, particularly on the training side of things, that face-to-face trainings obviously had to stop, and it's sort of been online training. But the changes that we've had in the last year or so, with a lot less officers in the office and many more working from home, to my mind presents a different, probably an increased and a different sort of information security concern in terms of, you know, just with the number of staff working from home and having equipment at home, there's got to be, I guess, an increased risk of theft of office equipment and laptops or whatever than there is where they're in the office, and there's got to be surely an increased risk of information disclosure, whether that's, you know, inadvertent or not, because, you know, with staff working at home on their dining tables or in their conservatories on a laptop rather than all being sat in the office together, surely there must be an increased risk of whether it be information on a screen or on paper or on emails that could be sort of inadvertently disclosed and cause complaints. That just what's been done in terms of that sort of changed risk of risk to sort of information security. And I know in the third quarter that there's been a fairly good increase in the number of online training courses, although it doesn't seem to be elected members. There's only been 2 courses completed for all elected members, so maybe that's something we should note, that we need to do some information governance online training. But yeah, has the online training been updated to take account of that risk of working from home rather than working in an office and that sort of thing?
Ms. Bateman? You're muted, Ms. Bateman.
There we go. Yes, thank you, Councillor Brown. We actually did, during the first lockdown, we issued, and it still stands, we did issue some additional guidance in terms of obviously remote working. We are, however, very fortunate in that largely the infrastructure was very quickly in place for people to access systems and access databases and do all the things actually that they would normally do sitting at the desk at work, but it's still in a completely secure environment. Laptops are all encrypted. Our email is 95% safe on Office 365, so it's all encrypted. So actually, and because now most of the transfer of information and the storage of information and everything else we do with information is electronic, we are really very safe. Now, I acknowledge that what you can do is perhaps theft is an issue, but because the laptops are encrypted, it is not, curiously, it would not be considered high risk. In terms of disclosure, there is no significant additional risk because, again, we are working with entirely secure environments, even though we're sitting at home. And disclosures really is largely where people either make a mistake, and that's simply because they don't understand the law. But most of it hasn't made it, to be honest with you, any less safe, Councillor Brown, really, the remote working, because we have the infrastructure, we have everything really very securely tied up. And so had we been looking at people carrying a lot of manual data and all of that sort of thing, it would be more significant. But now, really, today, it makes very little difference at all.
Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, this is going to be very, very quick. I think page 52, I'm going to point out a typo, that's all.
Thank you.
On the chart, cross-cutting requests, they've both got 2019-20. Should it be 2020-21?
It should. Thank you very much. I picked that out. Thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor Phipps. Yeah, I have identified that.
Thank you very much. We've given that, I think, a pretty good airing for a report. In the recommendations, all 4 of those recommendations are for noting. I won't read them out on this occasion, given that they are for noting. So, Ms. Bateman, thank you for your report, and the recommendations are duly noted.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the report. Good evening.
Takes us to item 9 on the agenda, which is BCP Council Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, RIPA, and the policy approval. And this is a paper for Nigel Stannard, the Head of Audit and Management Assurance. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. I know I've spoken before, but my first substantive item. So good evening, members. Good evening, everyone. So this paper asks A&G Committee to approve a new BCP RIPA policy. The first and probably most important thing to say is that this policy will be used very infrequently. And because of that inherent infrequentness, it's arguably more important for us to have a very clear and concise policy because of how rarely it's used, and it needs to be clear and concise for that reason. Just to illustrate that, BCP Council hasn't used RIPA since it came into being on the 1st of April 2019. And although it's quite hard for me to check this 100%, I am confident that it looks like the legacy councils of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole respectively did not use RIPA for 3 years prior to LGR either. So just to illustrate that point. The second key thing to say is that certain types of covert surveillance can only be undertaken by BCP Council if we get it approved by a magistrate. So that's explained in the policy at paragraph 8 of the report. That said, it's also just worth noting that we can undertake certain covert surveillance without a magistrate's approval, and that's highlighted in Appendix A if people want some detail there. Paragraph 14 explains that previously the acquisition of communications data was covered by RIPA, but this has been augmented or supplemented by recent new legislation called the IP Act, the IPA Act, which came in 2016, but only came into operational use in 2019. At the time of writing this report and the policy, our view was that BCP Council would be best served to have a separate IPA policy covering the acquisition of communications data, and that's explained in paragraph 15. However, Susan Zeiss, the monitoring officer, has developed a really useful advisory link to a colleague in the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, and they've shared with us some correspondence from other local authorities that they've recently had, which suggests that that might not be the best approach. So we're going to reconsider that. So in short, we may have a separate policy for communications data, or we may revise this policy in time. Either way, it's important, I think, that we approve this policy tonight to ensure we've got strong governance in place if we do need to use covert surveillance. So happy to take any questions, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. And on the basis that we do approve this policy tonight, can I take it that you and Ms. Zeiss will come back with any of those amendments in a timely way to audit and governance in the future, if that is seen to be the right way forward?
Absolutely, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Stannard. Yeah, as Mr. Stannard will know, I think the RIPA and regulation in the Investigatory Powers Act has been was always a hot topic at Poole Council since about 10 years or so ago, when there was some concerns over how the council had used it, and which hit the national press for some time and became quite a major issue about covert surveillance of parents relating to children being in sort of areas to go to particular schools and that sort of thing, and caused quite a big issue, a big stir at the time. And I know following that, then at the audit committee, I think in Poole, we used to have fairly regular reports about sort of how often these powers were used, which was always of interest, although as Mr. Stannard's noted, the last few years it doesn't seem that they have been used by any of the sort of legacy authorities and haven't been used by BCP. Now, it's tricky. I don't know whether that's a good thing that we haven't used these covert surveillance powers, or whether it's a bad thing. I'm fairly familiar with sort of what's done. My brother is actually senior in training standards for many years elsewhere in the country, and he's used these powers in his role, and he's actually authorised these powers for other staff to use in his role, and I've had conversations with him about it. And I know in Poole there's been issues around illegal shellfishing in the harbour, and these sort of powers have been used for that, and there's got to be concerns about counterfeiting and illegal trading, illegal tobacco imports, those sorts of things that there are occasions when the council, I think, would probably have good reason to try and detect illegal activities. And it concerns me to a bit of an extent that we've not used it, and I just worry now that it's become so bureaucratic and burdensome, and the hoops you have to jump through to be able to do this actually cause too much work and actually make it too difficult for officers to actually go through the process to do it. So they tend to try and work in alternative ways. But that said, I would like, and I'd actually like to just sort of propose an additional recommendation in the report. It's recommended that we approve the Council's Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act policy. I don't see, looking through that, anything about sort of reporting back about use of those powers, and I'd like to recommend that we actually request an annual report is brought to the Audit and Governance Committee, just detailing any use of those powers in BCP Council. Hopefully it will, it often be a straightforward report that is just noted that we haven't used those powers, but I think it's probably incumbent on us as Audit and Governance. These are fairly strong powers and they have civil liberties issues and can cause sort of difficult press coverage in certain circumstances, and I think it's probably incumbent on us as Audit and Governance to keep a watching brief on it. And I think just an annual report about the use of these powers would go some way to sort of, I think, discharge that responsibility.
Ms. Seiss.
I don't want to take over what Mr. Stannard. I would agree with you, Councillor Brown. I think that's a very good suggestion. Just to reassure councillors, though, that we are required and have been doing an annual report back to the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, which we're required to give a statistics report as well as a report on the use of powers. So it wouldn't be, onerous for us to just translate that into an annual report to this committee. But I think for me, the next most important step after getting the policy approved is to get certain elements of our officers trained in the areas where they may not realise when they need to make these requests. So that's what we're rolling out next. Members may have already been canvassed for dates. We haven't quite got that settled, but there is going to be some training for members and also training for some of our service areas where we feel it's most likely that these powers will be used. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Seiss. Mr. Stannard, would you like to react to what you've heard both from Councillor Brown and indeed from Ms. Seiss, please?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Hopefully I can assure Councillor Brown that the policy does indeed already include what he suggested. So on page 6 of the policy and page 77 of our pack, it says Audit and Governance Committee will monitor the Council's usage of its powers under RIPA on an annual basis. And if you when we get to agenda item 14 on the forward plan, you will see that there's a scheduled RIPA report scheduled in this committee's forward plan for the next financial year. And it is worth saying as well that we have had an annual report to this committee on an annual basis since the inception of BCP to explain the use or lack of in the case. May I also respond to Councillor Brown's comment about officers' perhaps reluctance to use it? I think, being frank, we should be using it sparingly, and we are required under the Act to consider every other alternative. That said, officers are authorising certain covert surveillance, and I think that might be what your did you say it was your brother-in-law or brother? So I think that sounds like what he's doing, because a council officer cannot authorise a full RIPA investigation. That has to be authorised by a magistrate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. Thank you. Councillor Phipps.
Oh, thank you. Just what I think is probably, well, for me, it is a simple question anyway. I've got up on Appendix A, surveillance that can and cannot be carried out by the LAs. I do remember back in Christchurch Council, we had RIPA training and all sorts of stuff. And some of it was to do with covert cameras where we had consistent fly tipping. Where does that come into this lot here somewhere? What can you do? Where is it? You may not have mentioned fly tipping specifically, but how does that work?
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. It's complex and it's hard to say black and white. Let me paint an example. So if we thought we knew who the perpetrator was and we were using our overt CCTV cameras to watch that establishment to the point of where the fly tipping was happening, that would probably be RIPA, because we're using, it's directed at an individual who we think it is. If we don't know who it is and we just put a camera up to see if we can catch the perpetrator, because it's not directed at an individual, that is unlikely to require a RIPA, and indeed we would do that. I am simplifying it a little there, but that's the broad message. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. I like things simple. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Stannard. Thank you, Councillor Phipps. Nobody else has indicated they wish to speak. I think, Councillor Brown, your suggested additional recommendation has been, if you like, squared off by Mr. Stannard.
Yes, but just thank you for that response. Actually, I've just seen where it says in the report. I think it's. I'm glad I raised it though, because it's, although it's sort of a little bit lost as one bullet point within the policy, but I think it's important that it's brought out and that we note that we are going to be discharging our function as audit and governance in terms of monitoring the sort of use of these powers. So I'm pleased with that response. So that's fine.
Right, thank you very much. So that takes us to the recommendation in the report, which is to approve the Council's Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act RIPA policy. I'd be grateful if anybody dissents from that as a decision, if they could please indicate by use of a hand. Nobody has. So in that case, this committee is approving the policy. Thank you all very much. Takes us on to item 10 on the agenda, which is the Annual Governance Statement 2019-20 Action Plan Update, and that's for you again, Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think it's worth just a little reminder that we're looking at last year's annual governance statement and obviously the action plan for last year. And you'll recall that the council identified 4 significant governance issues. 2 of those issues were immediately addressed at the point they occurred, and all of that was described to this committee in some detail last year, and so obviously they didn't need to feature on an action plan, and they were namely an adjustment process to the highways register and the omission to make available for public inspection the annual governance statement in June 2019 of one of the previous legacy councils. So those 2 issues were dealt with and didn't feature in the action plan because they were resolved. So this report covers the 2 other issues where we do require an action plan, and those being the governance of children's services and governance arrangements associated with key partners, wholly owned companies, trusts and contractors. So the tables in the report go through those actions and updates for you. Obviously, there's a lot, as we all know, there's a lot of activity on children's services, a lot of governance boards that have been set up to monitor the arrangements there. So I've given a summary only there of that, because it would be, fairly comprehensive to go into any more detail there, and then concentrated perhaps more on the governance associated with key partners, wholly owned companies, and gone through what we've done in a bit more detail on that. You'll see that in that section in table 3, there's a gap in the review of the parks entities, and in consultation with Councillor Beasley at briefing, and we could come to this in the forward plan, we're perhaps suggesting a presentation style in the same way that you've received on the Bournemouth Housing Companies, the BBML and BH Live. So if we do a similar presentation from officers for audit and governance, that would cover that gap that's still there at the moment. In terms of this year, I would expect both of these governance issues to feature somehow in the annual governance statement for 2021, albeit with a potential narrowing of focus to reflect the governance journey we've been on, the improvement journey we've been on, that we've done this year. So happy to take any questions, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stannard. We'll deal with the issue on the forward plan when we get to that later in the agenda, but we've provisionally allocated some specific time in which to do that. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Either or not, actually, as the case may be, of reviewing BH Live's business plan when it came up, and I have to say I thought it was one of the worst documents I've seen produced by a council or a subsidiary of a council or a partner of a council. And I noticed you've got it on your list to be reviewed in December, and I would suggest that you do that earlier rather than later, because I thought the whole document was appalling. I have sent my comments to Councillor Iyengar and others, but I just wanted to make that point.
In terms of BH Live, that is coming back to us, but it's been delayed because what we'd agreed previously was that we would be, if you like, the last port of call, and it has to go to overview and scrutiny, therefore prior to coming through to us. Councillor Brooke.
And with that, I notice it's been to Cabinet. Should it not have gone to ONS and us before going to Cabinet? Because Cabinet is the party that makes the decisions, and it therefore has gone, and ONS and us are the ones who are scrutinising, so it's gone to Cabinet without being scrutinised.
I wonder whether, are you able to help us on that, Ms. Seiss?
Chairman, Mr. Stannard may want to say something, but there's no absolute requirement for scrutiny to happen before cabinet decisions. It's obviously sometimes preferable, but it's not an absolute requirement, and there is pre-cabinet, pre-decision scrutiny and post-decision scrutiny that happens in an authority. I don't know, Nigel, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Thank you. I'm afraid I'm a little unsighted on whether that is correct. You know, I don't know for certain whether a report is going straight to Cabinet or via another committee, so I apologise for not knowing that detail, Chairman.
But just to be clear, to add to what I said a moment ago, the reason for a report coming to a future meeting of this committee is to review BH Live's contractual and governance arrangements, and that follows through from when this issue first came up quite some time ago, and we made a decision at that time that that report would go to overview and scrutiny first before it came to us, but that was purely about the contractual and governance arrangements, and I'm not sure that we're talking about exactly the same thing here. So let's not confuse them, would be my comment, I think. Did you want to come back on that, Councillor Brooke?
Yes, it would seem to me that the business plan is all part of an audit and governance responsibility. It's financial, as well as presumably saying how the organisation is being run and going to be run. And therefore, I would have thought it would be an automatic part of the work. And I notice on the forward plan, it was due to come today, and it was postponed because the report wasn't ready. I'm assuming, therefore, that although the business report is, excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat, assuming the business report obviously is complete because it was part of a cabinet paper last week, I would have thought the 3-month allocation in the forward plan is really something that we ought to look at much more closely when we get to that on the agenda, and see whether we can tighten things up a lot in terms of when we actually see it.
Just to clarify, this was on the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and we ran out of time effectively. I had a list of things to comment on, and I was told to put it directly to the various officers in question, which I did. I wrote a review of the business plan and I sent it to the officers, and I sent it to the chair of the Overview and Scrutiny and to the cabinet member. I'm afraid I couldn't attend the cabinet meeting, so I have no idea what happened at cabinet. It just struck me, and I'm just telling this committee, that there is something wrong because that business plan is a pile of rubbish, and somebody needs to look at it, because and sooner rather than later.
Well, Councillor Cox, I'm happy to take it up with probably the Chief Executive outside of the meeting. Your comments are noted, but I think I should emphasise that they're your personal comments. Yeah. And we're at a stage, I think, with BH Live where there are lots of issues being discussed, particularly those that have been brought around by COVID and the outcomes of COVID. And I think there is a real will by the management of BH Live to make sure that whatever comes forward in the future is based on knowledge. But the trouble is at the moment that there is a great deal of uncertainty in that knowledge as a result of the speed of coming out of COVID and all the rest of it. And that has very material impacts on the business plan of BH Live. So the second point, of course, is that we still are dependent on what we'd already agreed, which is to wait for Overview and Scrutiny to do its work before that work then comes back to Audit and Governance, and hence the reason why in the forward plan there is a span of meetings to which it might come back to, the earliest of which is our next regular meeting on the 29th of July. And I would hope that that will be achievable. But as I say, we are dependent upon Overview and Scrutiny having already deliberated on it. So if I could take up the issues that you've raised, perhaps with the Chief Executive outside of this meeting, I think that's probably the best way forward. Does that satisfy you for this evening, Councillor Cox?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Does that satisfy you as well, Councillor Brooke?
Yes, are informed of your discussions with the Chief Exec.
Yes, certainly, of course, and I'd expect to do that as a matter of course anyway. Councillor Phipps.
Yes, thank you. Just wanted to ask about, I'm just looking about this, reading a bit of this, governance arrangements with key partners, etc., etc. And some of them, the ones that are listed here in the table, specifically Bournemouth Building and Maintenance, Seascape, etc. And you've got 5 parks charitable trusts. So obviously charities or charitable trusts or whatever can be included in this. And when I looked at this, I was actually looking to see whether what was Bournemouth Parks Foundation is now the Parks Foundation would have been included here. Because I know that, and that's just gone through Cabinet, that it was Bournemouth Parks before, and it's now applies to the whole of the new council. And I know that there's a lot of sharing of services. There are officers who are on that charity that also work for the council, and there's quite big amounts of money involved, whereby that foundation applies for charitable money and then it's spent within the council. And I just wondered why actually they're not on here as one of the, companies or charities or whatever.
Well, if I can help you perhaps on that one, Councillor Phipps, when we get to the forward plan, we do have a proposal around audit and governance and the governance of parks, and that particular part that you've just told us you think is missing, and that's something about which there has been correspondence between me and the chair of Overview and Scrutiny, as recently as last night, actually, who had raised this issue with me directly, and with the input of legal through Sean Ballagall and Ms. Seiss. We have gone back and explained what it is that we're doing to address the issues that were of concern to overview and scrutiny. But more importantly for this committee, as you'll find, we are trying to allocate some time to that alongside the risk paper that we talked about earlier for the additional meeting that we've got on the 10th of June. So I hope that helps to answer your questions. I don't know, Mr. Stannard, from our meeting yesterday, is there anything you could add to that, do you think?
I can say to Councillor Phipps the rationale for why it wasn't there, but I do agree that it should be there. The rationale it wasn't there is that BCP Council is a trustee of the ones on this schedule, whereas BCP Council is not a trustee or of the Bournemouth Parks Foundation, but employees are. So I agree with you that there's an absolute, there's some form of influence there, and so they should be incorporated into anything we do.
Yeah, oh, thanks. Well, thank you for that. That's quite timely then. I wasn't aware that these conversations were going on, but I am aware that there has been some questions asked by residents. I'm aware of that. And when I saw this, I thought this is an opportunity to ask a question. So thank you very much for the answer.
That's fine. And of course, it wasn't that anything was being hidden from you. It's just that we're going to talk about it later in the agenda. But of course, you wouldn't necessarily have known that.
Who knows? Who knew?
And I hope the scoping of what we're asking to be done there will be satisfactory as far as members of Audit and Governance are concerned, because obviously we want to get that right, and we want to make sure that members feel that they've had all the information they need in order to discharge their responsibilities properly as well.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if there are any other. I haven't seen any other hands raised on this item. I just want to go to the recommendations, and the recommendation on this item is to note the progress made to address the significant governance issues on the BCP Council AGS Action Plan 2019-20. Those are duly noted, and as I say, we'll talk about the other issues later on in the course of the meeting. Takes us on to item 11 on the agenda, which is internal audit and the quarterly audit plan update, including audit charter and audit plan 21-22. And that's you again, Mr. Stannard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So if we start on the charter first of all, so as with a lot of policies and documents that come to this committee, it's an evolution of the charter that we've been using in internal audit. We're obviously constantly trying to improve it. Paragraphs 7 and 8 of the report highlight the key changes, and I hope you agree that they're sensible changes. They are around the implementation timeline for recommendations, particularly high and medium recommendations, and then also a little bit of a formalisation of the follow-up speed, given that our audit plan now has been and is increasingly risk-based. So we don't do annual, or rarely do annual reports or audit reports of the same thing now. So if we don't follow up in a timely way, it can be quite a long time before the next audit. So that's the changes proposed in the charter, or the material changes anyway. The internal audit plan then is a document that you were consulted on back in February, and it's pretty much as you agreed in January, albeit with the sensible adjustment that Councillor Mike Brooke suggested, where we would keep the audit days at 60 for the transformation and efficiency line bedded, and obviously I've had to tweak a couple of other lines just to nick a few days to make that back up to 60, and I've mainly done that on sickness, and I've looked at our sickness record, and I'm hoping that home working, there's evidence there that the internal audit team is having less sickness as a result of home working mainly. So that's where I've taken it from. We then move into the fourth quarter activity report of internal audit, and obviously we try to evolve this and trying to make this information useful to you. So what I've done is I've added the number of recommendations that we've made for each audit in the table in paragraph 20, and I hope you find that useful. That's a new feature. And then in paragraph 21, we've outlined for the audits where we have given partial opinion as required by the charter. We're giving you a bit more information, and again, please tell me if it's too much information or not enough information. So that what we've done there is just laid out the issues that have been identified that have led to those partial opinions, and obviously confirmed that management are in agreement with the recommendations we've made to make those things better. Paragraph 22 outlines the audit work still in progress, and as with any annual plan, it's now a concerted effort to get all that over the line without bleeding too much into the next financial year. So a big push in the team there. We then move into the significant other work, and I just wanted to point out paragraph 25, which was quite a big piece of work we did for one of the directors around Sturt Court, and there's a bit of detail around the recommendations we came up with and some reporting that we've done to the PHP board on those recommendations to improve things there. So happy to take any questions, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stannard. Councillor Cox.
Thanks for that, Nigel. I think it's a really good report. Can I just make one suggestion? Is that where you've got the table? I think it's on table. I think it's paragraph 22 with the recommendations, the number of recommendations, that you put some comparisons with previous years at the bottom. Just so that we know how many, high, medium, low recommendations there were in previous years. It would be quite useful just as a comparison.
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, noted, Councillor Cox. I think the caveat from my perspective is that the scope and the type of audits we're doing are not necessarily annual or cyclical, so comparison could be a little confusing. But what I will do is where we do key assurance audits, for example, and where the scope is fairly fixed, I think your suggestion's excellent. So we'll incorporate it in the ones where it makes sense to do so.
Very good.
You happy with that, Councillor Cox?
Yes, very. Thank you.
Excellent. Good. Nobody else has indicated that they wish to speak. In that case, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stannard. I'll take us to the recommendations, and we're asked to approve the internal audit charter and agree that the chair signs the document to record this approval, which will probably be a virtual sign-off by use of email. Approve the internal audit plan 2021 to 22. Note the 2021-22 budget for the internal audit service, which has been previously approved by Council, and finally to note the progress made and the issues arising on the delivery of the 2020-21 internal audit plan. If members could indicate if they don't agree with those 4 recommendations. Councillor Cox, you've got a hand up. Is that from your previous question? So nobody has indicated. So, Mr. Stow, those 4 recommendations are approved by the committee. Thank you for your report.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Takes us on to item 12 on the agenda, which is the External Auditor Annual Audit Letter for the year ending the 31st of March 2020. This will be familiar to members of the committee, but it's really just to conclude the formal process. I'll therefore introduce our external auditors from Grant Thornton, familiar to members of this committee, Paul Dossett and Sam Harding. And I think, Mr. Dossett, at the same time, you will want to introduce 1 or 2 changes in the team for BCP Council. So I'll leave you to introduce that, Mr. Dossett. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I will start by going through this letter and then follow up with the changes. So so you recall from the last meeting of the committee, we were on the verge of signing off the 1920 accounts, which we duly did the next day as planned on the 12th of March. And this letter merely replicates, it's a summary version effectively of what you saw on March the 11th in terms of the audit findings report. So this is just a summary of that. So there's no new information in this letter. This letter does actually mention that because the timing of signing the audit on March the 12th, once we sign the audit, then we then carry out required work on the whole of government accounts. That's a sort of additional process that government requires, and obviously that took place after we signed the accounts. At the time this letter was sent to committee, that work was ongoing. I'm now pleased to report that work is now finished, and as a consequence of that work having been submitted, the audit can be certified closed, which it duly has, which means that 1920, in all regards, from an audit point of view, is now closed and finished, and we're moving on to 2021. And in that respect, 1920 marks my final year as the engagement lead for BCP and predecessors. I was the engagement lead for Bournemouth and for Poole Councils prior to the creation of BCP. And so my time is done in the sense that if you take the whole of that period, it's 6 years in total, and under ethical standards and the PSAA rotation requirements, it means I need to move on. I will be handed over to my successor, Peter Barber, who will introduce himself shortly and talk about the progress report as well. Before I go, I would very much like to thank officers and members for their support in my time as the engagement lead. What I found particularly positive is that audit is sometimes can be adversarial, can be difficult, but I found the way officers and members have dealt with us as an audit function has been really positive and courteous and polite. Even where we've disagreed on things and we've found the odd bit frustrating between ourselves, it's always been done in absolutely the right manner. And I would like to thank officers for that and members, because it's been a really positive experience in that respect. So that's really all I'd like to say. Obviously, I wish you all well in the future, and I'm sure with Pete and Sam, obviously, who's been your manager over many years, we'll carry on into the next year in a positive frame and continue that what I found to be an excellent working relationship. So if I stop there, Chairman, perhaps if I let Peter introduce himself, and then we can just take any questions on this report, and then I'll formally hand over to Peter for the next paper.
Yes, certainly. Well, welcome to the meeting, Mr. Barber. If you would like to do that introduction, and then I've got a few words I'd like to say, and then, as Mr. Dossett has suggested, we'll go back to the report, which is for noting, before we move on to the next substantive item, which is yours as well. Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, everybody. So, by way of introduction, my name is Peter Barber, and I am a director with Grant Thornton. And as Paul said, I will be taking over as your appointed auditor with effect from 2021. So, just a little bit of background about myself. Been in public sector external audit for close on 29 years now, working initially with the Audit Commission until 2012 before moving across to Grant Thornton. So I have a portfolio of both local government and health audits across the Southwest, and I'm very much looking forward to working with you and building on the good relationships that have been established by Paul and the rest of the team as part of the first year audit at BCP. And although Paul will no longer be a member of the audit team going forward, he is still available to myself and the rest of the team to ensure that that cumulative knowledge and experience is not lost in our planning and our approach in 2021. And obviously, in addition, as Paul also mentioned, Sam Harding, as your manager, remains on the audit, providing that further continuity. So that's just a little bit about myself. I'll probably pause there, Chairman, if I may, and then we'll take questions on the first item before I introduce item 13.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barber, and welcome to the external audit process here for BCP Council. I'm confident that particularly with Sam Harding being with us throughout, that there will be a seamless process to go through, and I think that's always something that we would want to see. So thank you for that, and I'd just like to say a few words of thanks to Mr. Dossett for his 6 years. I have experienced that during the time that I was part of the time that I was leader of Bournemouth Council, when obviously you were acting as our external auditors for Bournemouth, and more latterly in terms of chairing audit and governance for BCP Council. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and I think the relationship that you have struck and maintained with senior officers, most particularly Adam Richins, has been one that has been grounded in true professionalism and objectivity, and I'm very grateful for that. I think we've all probably in the past had experiences where that doesn't work quite as well as it has, and it has been a process which I think has benefited both organisations and indeed the audit process in general for our organisations as well. So could I say thank you very much, wish you well for the future. I'm sure that our paths will cross in some way or another in the future, and I'm glad to hear that Mr. Barber will be able to call on you for continuity. I think that's really, really important, and that we're not trying to learn from scratch in the process when some of the people change. So we wish you well, and we're very grateful for the work that you've done with us in the past.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
So members, just dealing with item 12 and the conclusion of the formal process for the annual audit letter, the recommendation is to note the audit opinion and findings of the Council's external auditor following their audit of the Council Statement of Accounts 2019-2020. That is duly noted, and as Mr. Barber indicated, takes us on to item 13, which is the audit progress and sector insight update, which I think I'll pass back to our external auditors to speak to.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Take you through the progress report. This follows the standard format of an update on progress against the current year audit, as well as providing a summary of emerging national issues and developments that might be of relevance to you as members of the Audit and Governance Committee. So I suppose to start with, I'm conscious that in a normal year, we would probably be bringing the audit plan for 2021 to this meeting of the committee. However, we're probably about 2 or 3 months behind where we would normally want to be in the audit cycle, and that's a result really of us still not having sufficiently progressed all our outstanding audits for 1920. Paul mentioned earlier that your accounts for 1920 were signed off in March. We still, as a firm, have a small number outstanding that we have been focusing our limited resource on, as have the other firms within the sector. So as at this point in time, we've not sufficiently completed our planning to produce that plan. But what I've sought to do in this update report is just provide a little bit of an insight into the main areas of focus and what we'll be doing in the following few months. So the aspiration is that we get the planning done probably in about the next 4 or 5 weeks, and it would be our intention to furnish officers initially with a draft plan for consideration, and then once we've approved it with officers, we will then bring it to the next available meeting of this committee. So just a little bit about the approach for 2021. From an opinion perspective, clearly the focus again in 2021 will be on the areas of the accounts that are subject to the greatest risk of misstatement. So if I just refer members of the committee to page 172 of your papers, you'll see on the right hand side that the areas of land and buildings and pension fund liabilities and COVID, interestingly, no doubt areas that you will be more than familiar with based on the work that was undertaken by my predecessor last year. Those areas again will be a particular area of focus. And given that our findings from last year had a number of issues around there, what we have sought to do is prioritise those areas as part of the planning and interim work that we've done to date. So there have already been discussions with officers around elements of those items of account, including some early engagement with the valuer, which should bode well going forward as we move forward through the audit cycle. Just in terms of the other area of responsibility as your external auditor is the value for money. I understand once again this has been trailed at earlier meetings of this committee. The criteria for VFM has changed for 2021 following the introduction of the new NAO code. And over the next few months, what we will be seeking to do is engage with officers and members to frame our approach in this area in a bit more detail. And there is increased focus within the new code, and there is a recognition that greater resources will be required on our part as your auditors, but also on the part of the council in terms of providing with evidence to support our assessment in each of those areas. And interestingly, the NAO recently, I think it was actually on Monday, in response to that, have announced an extension to the deadline to complete this element of our work, and that's been extended by an extra 3 months following the date of the opinion. So what we will be doing is we will be engaging again with officers to discuss how best to do that, given officers' other commitments. Just in terms of sign-off and deadlines, on page 176 of your papers, I've indicated there in the progress report that we're looking to bring forward the target sign-off date for the opinion work for 2021. So our provisional date is December 2021. I recognise that this is after the September 2021 target set by MHCLG, but nonetheless does reflect an improvement on where we were in 1920. And Chair, the only other thing I probably wanted to pick up at this point in terms of progress with the audit is the fee. I'm conscious this can often be a sensitive area. So on page 175 of your papers, we've sought to provide some indicative fees here for 2021. And as I said, these are indicative based on our planning to date, and it would be my intention to refine those as we move through the audit process and provide you with a bit more of a detail in terms of what they're likely to be and a further breakdown. And as always, those additional fees will be subject to public sector audit appointments approval. So, Chairman, I wasn't planning to say anything else at this stage in terms of progress on 2021. Perhaps it would be opportunity just for me to stop at this point before I go on to the emerging issues and sector update, to take any questions if anybody has any in relation to 2021.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barber. Councillor Cox.
Well, actually, Councillor Beasley, I'm actually talking about the previous item, which you went on without actually having a vote on it. So I wanted to make some comments on the previous report, if that's possible.
Yes, I apologise. It wasn't necessary to take a vote because it was a report for noting, but I'm sorry if you didn't have that opportunity. I didn't realise that's when your hand came up on the screen. I'm sorry.
It did, yes.
So it's not on this item, it's on the previous item.
It is on the previous item, yes, if that's
right.
okay.
Well, if you'd like to ask your question now, that would be fine. Thank you.
Well, it's in connection with the issues that the auditor's already noted, and is clearly part of the risks for the current year, and that's to do with the problems to do with valuations. And I do think rather than just noting this, the audit committee needs to be a bit more proactive in terms of actually finding out how BCP are going to deal with the issues, because these are significant problems that they have identified in their audit in terms of the way the BCP go about valuing some of their assets, and even finding some of their assets, seem to be losing them or not identifying them. So I do think there are some significant issues. I mean, some of them, they may be below their materiality levels, but they are still quite significant amounts. And I just wondered whether we shouldn't be, rather than just noting this report, suggesting that the further report is generated to ask the question, what are we going to do to improve the position, particularly, it would appear, in relation to the Bournemouth valuations?
Probably not entirely fair to ask Mr. Barber to answer that. No. I don't know. Perhaps probably better that I go back to Mr. Dossett.
Thank you.
And then I'll come to Mr. Povey, who's indicated as well.
Yes, I mean clearly, I think as we've reflected in our report, the first year of the council obviously existed in an environment of multiple valuers and multiple processes, and some big challenges at Bournemouth, at the Bournemouth sort of end of things in particular. Obviously, council officers are fully aware of this issue, and I know that new arrangements have been put into place to take that forward. I mean, perhaps I'd hand over then to Mr. Povey to perhaps explain to the committee how those arrangements are progressing.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Mr. Povey.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, good evening, members. The audit findings report that was accompanied the accounts in the March meeting did actually have an action plan in it with the management responses for how we were dealing with the issues that were raised by the auditor. In short, yes, we for 2019-20 we had the variety of legacy valuers, but for the year of audit now we've engaged a single valuer to do all of the general fund assets, so that's a significant improvement. And as Paul said, we had an early meeting with them, I think it was in January, to go through with Grant Thornton and the valuer the areas where we specifically wanted to make sure we had evidence and timely valuations returned to us. In addition to that, we've been working with the estates team on what assets potentially we don't have floor plans for, and we've identified resource to make sure that they are produced for assets that are likely to have an impact on the accounts, so they'll be available for 2019-20. And we've also worked with the internal valuer who's doing the HRA, the housing stock, to improve the controls within their spreadsheet in terms of reconciliations and checks and balances. The other thing I'd just say is where as Councillor Cox says, we were losing assets. what the auditor was auditing was our accounting fixed asset register. So the fixed asset register that drives the valuation figures, the depreciation figures in the balance sheet. The assets that we were talking about that didn't appear on there in the main were grass verges and the like, which didn't have a value and wouldn't be subject to depreciation. Of course, the council has records of them assets on its property terrier and so on and so forth, but having them or not having them in the asset register didn't affect the accounts at all. But for completeness, we are putting them on there.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Povey. And so I think it would be right to say that these issues have been discussed. They were discussed at the last meeting, and those proposals came forward. There's nothing further to report back as far as the external auditor is concerned. Does that satisfy you to the extent of this evening's meeting, Councillor Cox?
Yes, I just noting that we should, that we're doing something about it as
yes,
an AFG committee.
Yes, sir.
It would be worthwhile adding.
I'm not sure you were at the last meeting, were you?
No, I wasn't. No.
No, and I think therefore that's probably the result of that is that you won't have been necessarily familiar with what we discussed and agreed at that meeting. But thank you for raising it. So moving on, can we? Are there any questions for Mr. Barber from the Audit Progress and Sector Insight update that he presented a moment ago? Your hand is up, Councillor.
Yes, it is. I've still got another one on this one. Yeah. It was actually to do with the audit fee, and I'm struggling to find what I saw before. Am I right in thinking that the audit fee went up about £50,000 in the current year? And was it? I'm sure I read somewhere it was 150 and it's gone up to 200,000. In which case, that does seem an extraordinary increase.
So who could help?
If I may, Chair.
Mr. Barber.
I'm conscious that during the course of 1920, the fee for BCP, as was the case for almost all of our local government bodies, increased, and that was due to a number of factors. But the biggest of those was the impact of COVID and the remote working, which meant everything in terms of audit procedures and testing took longer than planned, and that was reflected in an element of the proposed increase, as was some of the other increases in the areas that we've just touched on, land and buildings in particular. And I suppose, not wanting to go back over those in detail, all those additional fees, and I think the £50,000 that has been quoted by Councillor Cox is the value that we're dealing with here, is currently subject to approval by public sector audit appointments. So in terms of the controls that you have in terms of the Audit and Governance Committee over the reasonableness of those additional fees, the control is public sector audit appointments, who I can assure you from first-hand experience do seek significant amounts of evidence to justify the need to do that additional work. And although that fee is quoted in the annual audit letter for last year, it will not be billed. The additional fees will not be billed until we've had a final sign-off from PSAA, which we are hoping to receive soon.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. Anything else, Councillor Cox?
Yes, just for Mr. Peter Barber's knowledge, I am an auditor myself, so I'm familiar with the extra time that is being taken on audits, and I do appreciate that. However, that was quite a substantial increase of 33%, and I do appreciate that some of that could well have been to do with the problems associated with the valuation of the properties, but I would not have expected that increase to have carried on if the increase in the properties problems have been sorted or in the process of being sorted. So I'm surprised that it's carrying on. The increase is carried on in the next year's plan. I would have expected a more significant reduction.
And once again, if I may, Chairman.
Certainly, Mr. Barber. So
the proposed increase for 2021 is actually driven by a number of different factors. I touched on it in my presentation, but one of the most significant changes for 2021 is the introduction of the new VFM code and the new NAO code criteria. So the NAO are responsible for setting out the VFM criteria across local government, and they review that every 5 years. A review has recently taken place, and the new NAO code criteria with effect from 2021 has been released. And that is much more prescriptive in terms of the role for the auditor. There was some criticism levied at the older VFM approach because it was based on risk and reporting was done by exception. And a lot of the local government bodies were unhappy with the binary yes you do or no you don't have effective arrangements in place for VFM. So having taken on board stakeholder feedback, the NAO have come up with new criteria, which means we are required to go into more depth in 3 new areas, and we're required to report in considerably more detail on the arrangements, highlighting best practice, but also identifying those areas where there is scope for you to refine your arrangements, and in particular to ensure that we are making recommendations where appropriate to ensure that those arrangements can be improved. So the reason for the increase in 2021 is predominantly driven by that, but there is also the continued, and I think it is a continued focus by regulators on the auditing and accounting standards, which invariably necessitate us going into even more detail to get assurances over your numbers. And one of the areas that I was going to touch on in a moment when I came on to talk about the sector update is audit estimates, where there is yet further requirements placed on not just us as your auditors, but on management and those charged with governance to understand better those particular areas of the accounts that are subject to greatest estimation and judgment, and for us to get that information in more detail from management, assess it and conclude on it, and that invariably takes more time and is resulting in increased fees.
Councillor Cox, did you want to come back, or is
no, I've probably flogged that to death. My only comment would be that in respect of your last point, I understand exactly where they're all coming from. It's just it does stick in the throat that we seem to be paying because you're being told to do your job properly. Sorry, that's I don't mean that as a personal criticism. I mean that for the audit profession generally. This is we seem to be getting, well, this is a significant increase from 33%, and I think that needs to, personally, I think that needs to be broken down a bit. You've mentioned about 2 or 3 different areas why it's increased: the COVID, the valuations, and now the value for money element, and that I feel as though that needs to be broken down. To show where's the increase arising from. I have don't get me wrong, I have huge amounts of sympathy. I'm an auditor. I have to deal with audit committees as well. So I unfortunately I've not been given the option of a 33% increase anywhere. So I'm rather jealous.
Well, Councillor Cox, I mean, you've raised these sort of issues around external auditors' fees in the past, I seem to recall, and I don't want to get into the kind of language that I think you were leading towards at this meeting, certainly not under my chairmanship. But I would ask perhaps Mr. Barber if he could supply a little bit more data. That's fine. I don't see any problem with that coming forward, and I'm sure that it'll be easily done. But I don't think that in the meeting itself is the time to be discussing a negotiation or anything else about fees. Happy to take it up outside of the meeting, and perhaps Mr. Povey, you could pull together whatever data it is that is available and that we might be able to use internally to determine that. If I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do need a point of contact here within BCP Council to make sure that it happens in the appropriate form.
Could I respond, Chairman?
Yes, of course you can.
Yes, of course. If Grant Thornton would like to, if Peter would liaise with me, and we can get the reconciliation there, and then I'll liaise with you, Chair, about how you want to proceed with that information.
That would be, I think, the best way to take it forward. Thank you. And I'm sorry if your first meeting, Mr. Barber, has, if it's left you with the feeling you've been put on the spot. That was certainly never my intention, and I'm sure it wasn't Councillor Cox's intention either. Did you wish to say a little bit more about the sector update? I think you mentioned a moment ago.
If I may, Mr. Chairman,
Certainly.
yeah, and not wanting to sort of dwell on the point, but just to conclude on that previous issue from Councillor Cox, there is absolutely a breakdown of the makeup of the additional fees for last year, and that was set out in previous correspondence. In terms of the current year, 2021, absolutely was always our intention to provide a more thorough and detailed breakdown of the proposed additional fees, and that will form part of the audit plan that I referred to earlier, that we would look to bring to hopefully the June meeting of this committee. But I'm more than happy to liaise with Mr. Povey to provide that additional information. So having discussed where we are in the audit cycle for 2021, I just wanted to conclude on the progress report and just go through the second part of it, which is the sector update. And there are a number of areas here for information that may be relevant to members of this committee. Chair, given the time, I'm not going to run through each of those, but I just, if I may, just wanted to pick out a couple of particular interest. The first of which is on page 181 of your papers, and I touched on this earlier in relation to estimates. So this provides a bit of detail about auditing estimates, and it's really just to advise the committee that there will be a separate paper coming to a later meeting of this committee, setting out management's response to a series of questions from us as the auditors, that will focus on a number of areas that we've asked every year, but we'll also be focusing in much more detail on those elements of the accounts involving, as I said, the greatest degree of estimation and uncertainty. And the important thing to mention here is that there is an expectation that management are not just, and I'm not suggesting this happens at BCP, but management, when they are relying on third-party experts such as valuers, that they're not just taking the information provided and lifting that into the accounts, but there is a degree of understanding and challenge where appropriate from management, and a recognition under this accounting standard that the understanding of those elements of the account subject to greatest estimation, and how that estimation has been arrived at, is also understood by this committee as those charged with governance. So once we do get that report out, no doubt that will be an interesting point of discussion as we move through the audit cycle. And I suppose the only other area that I wanted to touch on in terms of emerging issues is on page 183 of your papers. Some of you may have already had sight of some of the recent public interest reports that have hit the press. This is our Grant Thornton report, lessons from recent public interest reports. One of the main authors being Paul Dossett, that in my view provides some interesting observations here about the potential reasons that have led to the issuing of these critical reports at local government bodies, including Nottingham City, London Borough, Croydon, and Northampton Borough Council. And just digging in a bit more detail about how the issues arose, and some interesting observations around it in many cases being less about the governance model that exists within the council, but more actually about how it operates or doesn't operate in practice, and no doubt makes some interesting reading for councils elsewhere. So I just wanted to plug that one really and bring it to the attention of members of this committee if they haven't seen it already. So, Chair, as I said, not minded to go through the other areas, but more than happy to take any questions on any elements of the sector update.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barber. In terms of that final issue, it is something that we've been engaged with, and as you will be aware, after discussions with our Section 151 officer, Adam Richins, who sadly can't be with us this evening, we have actually scheduled a meeting online with you to get into further detail, further to meetings that I've had with him and with Mr. Stannard. So we wanted to do that so that we were properly prepared in terms perhaps of bringing something back to this committee so that we actually understood the depth and breadth of the whole scale of Mr. Dossett's report. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm not sure if this was the public interest reports, but I'm sure I read somewhere that we've talked about there being a problem in terms of the pension liabilities and auditing the pension liabilities because of the pandemic. And I just wondered if Mr. Barber could expand on that, and therefore, if there is a problem, what that problem is, and how are they going to get around it?
If I may, through you, Chair. Yeah. So to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of any specific issues in relation to pension liabilities generally. Clearly, pension liabilities within any council is an area of it's a significant figure in the bottom half of your balance sheet, a very large net liability in most cases, and is subject to a large degree of estimation and judgment. Hence the reason why the council will use an actuary to arrive at a figure, and it's a particular area of focus for us given the estimation involved. And last year, 1920, there were some further complications about getting assurance over that, given that in many cases pension funds either invest directly in property or indirectly through pooled funds in property assets, and there was a degree of material uncertainty given by actuaries and valuers in relation to that element of the assets held. I suppose where there is greater risk in terms of pension liabilities comes, we've touched on this earlier in this agenda in terms of partnerships, wholly owned companies, etc. And when organisations and when local government bodies set up companies, being very clear about the liabilities for any duty of employees that go across, and whether there is any obligation on the council itself to provide some sort of assurance over the carrying values of those and any future liabilities. And that is one of the issues that has been identified in a number of Grant Thornton reports about ensuring that when a council decides on a course of action that may involve setting up a company or working in partnership, that as part of the decision-making process, the decision makers are provided with complete and accurate information to inform that decision, including the financial ramifications, which aren't just about the ongoing revenue costs and capital expenditure. It's also about any liabilities that the council might be liable for going forward. Sorry, quite a long answer there, but I'm hoping that sort of got to the point.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Barber. Nobody else has indicated. So if we could go to the recommendation, which is that Audit and Governance Committee notes the external auditor's progress to date in delivering their responsibilities and the sector update provided, which we've heard at some length from Mr. Barber. If any member is not happy with that, could you please indicate? Nobody has, so that is duly noted. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to the Grant Thornton team for your input into our meeting this evening. It's appreciated. Look forward to seeing you both at the online meeting and at our next quarterly regular meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee. So members, that takes us on to item 14, which is the Audit and Governance Forward Plan. Just get it up in front of me. So we've talked about one or two of these issues already this evening, and in a moment I'll ask Mr. Stannard to give us an update. But in brief, if I could just take you to the section on the second page towards the top, where you'll see the BH Live contractual and governance arrangements, and you'll see a space there to determine which meeting it's going to be. I really do hope it will be the 29th of July. I can't imagine there's any reason that I know of why it couldn't slot into there. But in addition to that, we have put in extra meetings, as you will know, outside of the standard items that come forward in our quarterly meetings. And those are there really so that we can deal with other issues that perhaps wouldn't appear on our agenda with sufficient time otherwise. So we talked earlier about two in particular that we want to bring forward to the meeting on the 10th of June. And those are the parts governance presentation and the risk register workshop. Now we try to generally keep our meetings to 2 hours. I appreciate we've overrun, but that was the choice of members to do that this evening, and we think that we can do those two together with, I think there's one other minor piece of business as well within that time frame. And I've been very keen that those two reports coming forward to us in terms of presentation are totally relevant to us, and that they cut to the chase as quickly as possible so that we have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion at those meetings. So that's the bit I wanted to do at the beginning, and then there's a piece about training as well afterwards. Mr. Stannard, could you pick up the parts that I've probably missed?
Thank you, Chairman. Excuse me. I think you've covered it very eloquently. There was a couple of things I would just point out. So 6 line down on Appendix A is the use of RIPA that Councillor Brown raised earlier, and the very bottom of page 193, we've just heard from Peter Barber about the review of significant judgments and sources of estimation uncertainty. So having heard that, I think the discussion maybe is whether that item, the risk item and the parks presentation item, can we do that in 2 hours? And I think that's a discussion, I guess, for you as members, and how in depth you want those to be, and whether there might be an instruction to officers to therefore rejig things to perhaps only have 2 of those, and then obviously the knock-on effect through the municipal year forward plan. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, to help us through that, I don't see very much capacity left within our meeting on the 29th of July to do anything else. So the next additional meeting isn't until the 9th of September. So the issue really is, if anything doesn't hit the 10th of June, it's unlikely to be able to be fitted in very quickly afterwards. And I think both of those presentations are ones that members want to see because they will be timely and won't wait until later on after the summer. So I don't know whether members would agree with this, but if I could ask Mr. Stannard perhaps to have a look at that, and if we think that we haven't got enough time, then to come back to myself and the Vice Chairman. And so there are alternatives to that. We could have a meeting that lasted slightly longer than 2 hours, as we have this evening, or indeed, I suppose, we could try to fit in something else, but I don't think that's necessarily going to work within the BCP Democratic Services set up to find a space for another meeting. So if members are happy that that could be left with us to try to resolve outside of this meeting, then we'll do our best to do so. Are there any other matters for members around the forward plan? No, in that case, I take it that that you're content that we go forward on that basis. I wanted to mention a little bit about training. As members will know, I've been very keen that all members of Audit and Governance have adequate training, and that we cover what we need to cover so that members can have full and proper input into meetings and understanding of the work that we're doing. So we've been researching how that can be affected. We've been looking at courses run by SIPFA. We are looking at courses run by the LGA, or indeed any other sources. And the intention at this stage is to wait until after the annual meeting of the council at the end of next month, but so that we know who is going to be permanently on the committee, if there are any changes, because the first piece of training we would like to do is some really foundation training, if you like, for all members of Audit and Governance, so that even those with huge experience outside of the audit family within the council, and those who are absolutely brand new to it, all start with the same basic piece of training. And we would want to try and do that, if at all possible, probably sometime in June, maybe even the beginning of July, and then immediately after the summer to build on that basic training with some more specific training for all members of Audit and Governance. I'm very keen that nobody feels that they're getting left behind. I want everybody to go forward together so that we're all at the same level as soon as we possibly can be, and all have the same input into meetings of Audit and Governance. So that's the plan. I've discussed this with Mr. Stannard, who's done most of the work in terms of research. And I just wondered, Mr. Stannard, if there's anything you could add to what I've just said that occurs to you as to timescales, further training that may be of benefit after the basic training.
No, Chairman, I think you've cracked it. I think the only very minor additionality might be whether we can run some very what's the word, title specific training. So perhaps, for themes such as fraud training, perhaps fraud awareness, that the types of fraud that might be perpetrated against the council. So those sort of things, but they can be run internally by officers. So I think that would be a good augmentation with those other formal trainings that you've already outlined. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. So I take it that no comments coming back, that members feel happy and comfortable with what's being proposed. There is a finite budget to all of this, of course, and we're looking at ways of seeing how that budget might be able to be extended to enable us to get the level of training we need. Very clear in my mind that we want to get Audit and Governance front and centre of everything we're doing in this council, and without the knowledge and without the resources, it's very difficult to do that. So that's what we'll be pushing on with. So that takes me back to the recommendation on the forward plan, and we're asked to approve the forward plan as set out at Appendix. Can I take it that we're all in agreement with that? Anybody dissent from that? No. So that's the forward plan, and that's the way forward for the future of our meetings for this coming year. I would just emphasise, as I have done previously, if members have other issues which they think perhaps should be considered for some of those extra meetings, please let me know. I've put out emails about it. I haven't had much response this time, which is fine, because I can think of other things that are coming forward. But if there is something that's troubling you, or something you think Audit and Governance should be looking at that we haven't seen on the forward plan, let me know your suggestions, and then I will see whether we can add that in later on. Thank you very much. That takes us to the end of our agenda for this evening. Thank you all very much indeed for attending, and for the slightly later finish than usual. Thank you to officers for staying the course, and thank you to members for taking part in the meeting this evening. And I close this meeting of Audit and Governance at 8:29. Have a good evening.